Hey, seventh and eighth graders. So, we are going to be moving right along in our study of history, and we are going to be actually moving into the same time period. So, it's going to be the same years, roughly, that we've been chatting about with the Enlightenment and places like Holland and France and even parts of Italy and that area of Europe, but we're actually going to be moving way east, and we are going to start talking about Russia, Austria, Prussia, and some of those Eastern European countries that don't often always get talked about. So, we're going to be looking at what they were doing right around roughly the same time that the Enlightenment was happening in the western part of Europe. So I want you to keep that in your mind as we move forward. We are talking about a very similar time period to what we just left. And so I want you to think about that. Where is Western Europe during this time? What is Western Europe doing in comparison to what is happening in the places that we are studying? Now, as you watch my video, I want for you guys actually to have me like on one tab, and I want you to open another tab with the slideshow that I shared with you because I'm going to be like lecturing, talking through, teaching the slideshow to you, and you will be dragging and dropping in the words where they go. Before you move to that slideshow tab, though, I want you to look at this map. It says 1604 in the corner, and it shows on the left side I have a caption box that says it's a big picture view of all of Europe during the West and the East. So if we look at this big picture of Europe, where we're moving to now is this big Russia, where it says Russia right under the 1604. That's where we're moving now. And then that, what color would you call that? Like salmony place next to it that says the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. Within that, we're going to be having the Austrian and Prussian and Hungarian empires that we'll be studying. So we're going way east. If you look to the west, to the left, to the west, we have the Holy Roman Empire, France, and then parts of Italy. It says Naples, but things were really weird setup wise in Europe during this time. The Holy Roman Empire are countries like Germany and Switzerland that we know today. They just haven't been formed yet as those countries. And France. France is mainly where we were with Enlightenment. And Europe, the red country to the north of France, above France. England and France is mostly where we were during this Enlightenment period. So if you look right there, now we're going way to the right, way to the east, and looking at about the same time period into Russia. So this is where we are. You see where we are? It says Russia at the death of Peter the Great. So that's who we're going to be looking at for the next few slides, Peter the Great. But this is what Russia was. We had Russia in this green, and then he acquired a bunch of new territory in all these different green colors that we see. And then we see the Kingdom of Poland, and we see the Kingdom of Hungary in pink beneath that, and then the Ottoman Empire. So it says, please notice where. I want you to notice where Russia is, and then I want you to notice where Poland and Hungary were. So we've pointed them out. Russia's green, Poland is red, and Hungary is that pink country. I don't know why I'm pointing to these on my computer. You can't see them. And then I want you to know where the Black Sea is. So if you look where Poland is, see the red country, and I go straight down, straight south of there, see the Black Sea, which will be important in our study of Russia. And then I want you to notice the Caspian Sea. So find Russia and then go, or you can find the Black Sea again and go due east, which is the right. And you see that little strip of blue is the Caspian Sea. Okay, so if you want to move over to your slideshow about Russia, we'll just begin. We'll just jump right in, huh? Russia at this time was ruled by a czar, spelled two different ways, Tsarczar, both pronounced czar, and it's the absolute ruler of Russia. Very similar to like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes' idea of an absolute ruler would be something what the czar is, and similar to a king or a queen that we studied in Western Europe. The Tsar, um, the title of Tsar was passed down from family to family. And so right now, this family, they're called the Romanovs. They've been ruling Russia for a long time and would continue to rule Russia for a very long time. And they're a very powerful, wealthy, controlling family over Russia, have been and will be. And our Tsar right now at this time breaking into Russia is Peter. Pyotr is Peter in Russian. Russian is a very difficult language to learn, but that is Peter, and he's head of the family. And he is described as this cruel and terrifying ruler. He has a violent temper. He just wants to take over and be in control of all the land and will do anything to be in rule of all the land, all the territory. He's always getting into wars and battles because he wants land, he wants conquest, he wants to control everything. And he has this will of steel and he won't back down. So, going into this time, he had two main goals for Russia. He wanted to modernize it and to turn it into a great power because he was seeing what was happening in the West. He was seeing these Enlightenment ideas because he was a czar, right? He was this upper class person who traveled a lot and he could read. Unlike most peasants in Russia, they couldn't read, but he could read. And so he's seeing and taking note of all these things happening in Western Europe, and he was getting jealous because they weren't happening in his own country. And he's like, Russia needs change. Russia needs to become modern. Russia needs to become more like Western Europe. So that was his goal, to expand and to take over. So if you look at this map that your next slide goes to, you see that like mustardy orange color? That was Russia before Peter the Great took over. Okay, and then you see that big, like, what is that color? Brownish color? Gray brown. Says Siberia. That was all conquered right before Peter the Great took over. And then we see the red. The red is everything that Peter the Great took over during his time as Tsar. And then we'll be looking at the different Alexanders and Nicholases that take over after Peter, and their different territorial conquests. But basically, what Russia ended up doing was conquering everything except China on this eastern end of Asia, of Eurasia, of the Europe and Asian continent. They just wanted everything. So, when Peter ruled Russia, Russia only had from Poland in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west. Not a ton of land, but they didn't have any warm water access. That was the big thing that Russia was really lacking. If you guys know anything about Russian climate, you know that it gets really cold in the winter. Siberia is within the Russian territory during this time. Siberia is known as being one of the coldest places. It is so frigidly cold that they would send prisoners out there to work in these camps because the conditions were so undesirable, that is how they felt would be the best form of punishment, would be send people to these cold regions to work. And so they didn't have any warm water access. They didn't have any place in which they could um, trade and get ships coming, because right now our main form of communication and transportation and exchange of goods is through ships and through um, horse and carriage. We don't have planes, we don't have cars, we don't have modern technology that you and I know. Things are transported through ships and through horse and carriage. We don't even have a train yet. Ships and horse and carriage is how we transported things. And so Russia was basically isolated during the winter months because they had no ways to communicate with the outside world because they didn't have a warm water port. But they had a lot of sea around them. So, an ocean, oceans and seas around them. So during the summer months, a lot of Russians were sailors. They loved to sail, they loved to be out on the water and to escape the hardships of the Russian winters. because they did this because many of them were serfs. So a serf is someone who's bound to live and work on the land in which they are assigned to. It's like similar to slavery. You will never be free and you are forced to work this land. That's what a serf is. And they were the bottom of Russian society, the lowest of the low. And they were a majority. That's why we can say in that bullet point above that Russian society was arranged like a pyramid. The bottom was the biggest. All of these serfs covered the bottom area of Russian society. And then right up above them is called the gentry, just like your average middle class. These people had a job. They were probably like the store owners or the shoemakers or the people who owned the serfs, owned the land that the serfs work on, those kind of people. And then you have the boyars, the aristocrats, so like the people in political and government office, mayors and secretaries of states. That those are our common words. They wouldn't have called them that, but offices like those. And at the very top is the Tsar, Peter the Great. Nobody else below him, or nobody next to him. He is the tip top of that triangle. There's only room for one, and it's Peter the Great. So people looking in at Russia thought that they were backwards and barbaric because of the way in which they lived. They didn't have a warm water port. They didn't have these Enlightenment ideas that Western Europe was holding on to, and they were stuck in the cold for 8 months a year with no way to get out. And so they thought them as backwards and barbaric. Right before Peter the Great took over, though, thankfully, Russia had acquired a year-round port, a warm water port from um, a Turkish port called Azov to be able to trade and communicate now during the year. They had this warm water port that they could use. But one of the reasons in which Europe thought that Russia was backwards and a little bit barbaric is because Russia is in this weird situation within Europe in which they're right next to all the European countries, right? Border them all to the left. When you're looking at the map, all these European countries border them to the left. But if you look right below Russia, you have China. And then right to the right of China is Japan. So Russia has what we call a lot of Oriental influence from China and Russia and those, or excuse me, China and Japan and Mongolia, some of those Asian countries. And that was one of the reasons in which the rest of Europe looked at China as or at Russia as backwards and barbaric because of their Asian influences that were mixing with the European. So Russia is very unique because their culture had this mix of European and Asian influences working together. But Peter the Great didn't like that. He didn't like that they were thought as backwards and barbaric. He also really didn't like the heavy uh, Asian influence that was being had in Russia. He wanted to make Russia better than any country in Western Europe. He wanted them to be more like Western Europe and eventually better than Western Europe. So, to do this, he made all Russians wear European clothing. In Western Europe, men didn't have beards. In Russia, men had long, extravagant beards. It was cold. They needed something to keep their faces warm. Peter the Great said, no, no, men, you gotta shave those. It's not no shave November. Get those away. Men had to smoke tobacco because men in Western Europe smoked tobacco. It was the high class thing to do. So you're gonna do it too here in Russia. And women and men had to come together and socialize in these government ordered gatherings. Before now, it's not really commonly culturally accustomed for men and women to mix within Russia unless they were married. So, unless they were married, they didn't really hang out together. And so now Peter the Great is saying, nope, you guys have to hang out together. And I'm going to make these gatherings so that you are forced to hang out together. Peter the Great was doing all these things right because he wanted to become the greatest. He wanted everybody else to weaken, and he wanted to become the greatest. The exact opposite of what Jesus tells us to do in John's Gospel. when Jesus says that I must increase and you must decrease. The exact opposite. Peter the Great wanted to be the most powerful and everybody around him to be the weakest. Remember that pyramid, that little tiny point at the top, there's only room for one, and Peter the Great said it's going to be me. He built this large standing army to help him do this, to help him get all the power he possibly could. He built a large standing army. And then he began to slowly weaken everybody else's power in his country. Before now, the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia had some power and had some say, had some autonomy, some independence its own. But now Peter the Great says, I'm going to appoint some non-priestly person to be in charge of your church who will respond directly to me, which is completely different from how the church was run at the time. He also weakened that class right below Peter the Great called the boyars, the aristocrats, and he did this by creating a new family. He just took families that were already existing and he said, I'm raising you up to the level of nobility, and you respond directly to me and nobody else. You don't have any power, you don't have any say, but I'm going to make you noble. Here's some money, here's some wealth, here's some nice looking things. You are now powerful. Congratulations. But you are dependent on me. Peter the Great did this. He made everybody else weak and him more powerful by making everybody else dependent on him. He was the provider for everybody and nobody could do anything without him. But he was kind though. He did have a generous heart to him. He made different rules and regulations so that like peasants' houses were made of twigs and like branches and branches and leaves to cover them. And he made stricter regulations on the building of their houses so that they wouldn't burn down, because in the winter there was this big problem with peasant houses burning down because fires were lit all year. And so to prevent this, because he didn't want their houses to burn down, he made these regulations onto how they were to be built. And because he cared about the health and the fitness of his nations, he set rules for physical fitness on what you had to do and how you had to be. He also set up elementary schools for children because he wanted them to be able to learn and to be able to be educated, because he saw that Western European children were educated and they were learned. So it was slightly out of the generosity of his heart, slightly out of the I want to compete with Western Europe that he did this. Um, so I think that's all the slides that you have. It's a really good introduction with Peter the Great. So we'll go from there.